The snake in the bottle. It was a typical summer afternoon in rural Alabama, where the scorching sun made the air thick and suffocating. The year was 1987, and in the small town of Millerville, three boys walked along the dirt road that connected the town center to the more distant farms. The heat was so intense that even the stray dogs sought shade under the few trees that survived the drought. Jake, only 12 years old, led the small group. His blonde hair, bleached by the sun, contrasted with his tan skin, typical of someone who spent their days playing outdoors. Beside him walked Pete, his 11-year-old cousin, a skinny boy, but clever, always with a mischievous smile on his face. And completing the trio was Mark, the youngest, at just 10 years old, who made up for the age difference with courage that sometimes bordered on recklessness. The three were returning from another adventure in the outskirts of town. They had spent the morning exploring an old pond that had dried up during the drought, searching for treasures buried in the cracked mud. As always happened on these expeditions, they returned empty-handed, but with their heads full of new ideas for the next adventure. The road was practically deserted at that time of day. Only a few pickup trucks passed occasionally, raising clouds of red dust that stuck to the boys' sweaty skin. The only constant sound was the monotonous chirping of crickets, which seemed to intensify the feeling of heat even more. That's when Jake stopped abruptly, causing the other two to bump into him. "Look over there," he whispered, pointing to a cluster of rocks on the roadside. In the middle of the rocks, coiled and motionless, was a snake. It wasn't very large, maybe 5 feet long, with brown and yellowish scales that gleamed in the sun. At first the boys thought it was dead, but soon they noticed the almost imperceptible movement of its breathing. "It's alive," Pete murmured, instinctively taking a step back. "It's a copperhead," Jake said, who always bragged about knowing all the animals in the region. "My dad's killed several of these on the farm." Mark, the youngest, but also the most curious, approached a few steps. "Do you think it's sleeping?" "Snakes don't sleep like we do," Jake explained. "It's probably protecting itself from the sun. That's why it's there among the rocks." The three stood watching the animal for a few minutes. The snake remained motionless, only its forked tongue occasionally coming out of its mouth to capture scents around it. Its small black eyes seemed always to be vigilant, even in apparent lethargy. It was Pete who had the idea that would change everything. "You know what would be cool?" he said, with that tone of someone plotting some mischief. "We could capture it." "Capture it?" Jake frowned. "What for?" "To show everyone at school. Imagine everyone's faces when we show up with a live snake." The idea was tempting, but also scary. Jake, being the oldest and theoretically most responsible, hesitated. "It's too dangerous," he said. "If it bites one of us—" "Oh, it'll be easy. We just need to find something to put it in." That's when Mark pointed to the other side of the road. "Look over there." On the other side of the street, half buried in the sand, was a 2-liter plastic bottle. One of those soda bottles. It probably had been thrown there by some driver, and the sun and rain of recent months had faded the label until it was almost unrecognizable. "Perfect," said Pete, running to get the bottle. It was empty, and surprisingly, in good condition. The cap was tightly screwed on, and there were no holes or cracks. Jake was still reluctant. "I don't know, man. What if it doesn't fit?" "It'll fit," Pete guaranteed, mentally measuring the snake's size and the bottle's diameter. "Snakes are flexible. My grandpa always said a snake can get into any hole." The plan was formed. Jake would be responsible for distracting the snake, tapping it with a long stick they found on the roadside. Pete would hold the bottle, positioning it strategically, and Mark would be responsible for pushing the snake in the right direction when the time came. The first challenge was making the snake move. Jake began gently poking it with the stick, being careful to always stay in a safe distance. At first, the animal didn't react, but after some more insistent touches, it began to get agitated, raising its head and showing a defensive posture. "Now," Pete shouted, positioning the bottle opening towards the snake. What happened next was a mixture of luck, skill, and pure adrenaline. The snake, seeking to escape Jake's poking, slithered quickly in the direction the boys had predicted. With an agile movement, it partially entered the bottle, perhaps thinking it was a safe hiding place. "We did it!" Mark yelled, pushing the rear part of the snake that was still outside. Pete quickly capped the bottle, and all three stepped back a few paces, observing their capture with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Inside the transparent bottle, the snake writhed, clearly agitated by the situation. Its movements made a muffled sound against the plastic walls. "Now what?" asked Mark. Jake took the bottle and examined it more closely. "Let's take it home. Tomorrow we'll show everyone at school." The walk back to town was a silent celebration. The three took turns carrying the bottle, watching fascinated as the snake tried to find a comfortable position in the tight space. Occasionally, it would hit its head against the cap, as if testing the strength of its prison. When they reached town, it was already late afternoon. The streets were beginning to get more crowded with people coming back from work and shopkeepers preparing to close their stores. The boys knew they needed to be discreet. It wouldn't be good if some adult saw what they had done. Jake lived in a simple house in the town center, with a small backyard. His parents worked late, so he was sure he'd get home before them. It was the perfect place to hide the snake until the next day. "Where are we going to put it?" Pete asked, as they entered through the back gate. Jake looked around. The backyard had some fruit trees, a small chicken coop, and a little room that served as storage. That's where he kept his tools, old toys, and other boyhood treasures. "In the storage room," he decided. "Nobody will mess with it there." The small storage room smelled of old wood and damp earth. There were stacked boxes, some rusty tools, and a pile of junk that had been forgotten over the years. Jake found a dark corner between two cardboard boxes and placed the bottle there, upright. "Tomorrow morning, we'll get it and take it to school," he said, observing the snake one last time through the transparent plastic. The animal seemed to have calmed down a bit, coiled at the bottom of the bottle. "Will it be okay?" asked Mark, with a hint of concern in his voice. "Of course it will," Pete replied. "It's just for one night." The three said goodbye with the excitement of those who had something special to show the next day. Each went home, but none of them could think of anything else during dinner. Jake couldn't pay attention to his parents' conversation about drought problems and market prices. That night, he dreamed of snakes. He dreamed that the bottle multiplied into hundreds of bottles, all with different snakes inside. He woke up twice with the strange feeling that he had forgotten something important, but always went back to sleep thinking about the surprised faces of his classmates. The next morning dawned even hotter than the previous one. Jake woke up early before the alarm even went off. He took a quick shower, ate a piece of toast with butter that his mother had left on the table, and ran to the backyard. Pete and Mark were already there, waiting by the fence. "So, let's see our snake," Pete said, rubbing his hands with excitement. Jake opened the storage room door, and nothing. The place was empty.
"Where did you put it?" asked Mark, looking around. "Here!" Jake pointed to the space between the boxes. "I'm sure it was here." The three searched every corner of the small storage room. They turned over boxes, moved tools, looked under every object. There was no sign of the bottle with the snake. "Could someone have taken it?" Pete suggested. "Who would want a snake?" Jake was confused and frustrated. That's when Mark found it. The bottle was there, in the same place where Jake had put it, but fallen on its side between two larger boxes that had shifted during the night. The movement must have been caused by some small animal, maybe a cat or a rat, that had bumped into the boxes. "Here it is!" Mark yelled, picking up the bottle. But when he lifted it, everyone immediately realized something was wrong. The bottle was too light, much too light. Jake took the bottle from Mark's hands and examined it carefully. The cap was slightly loose, not completely open, but loose enough for... "It escaped," he murmured. The three stood in silence for a moment, processing the information. The snake had managed to loosen the cap during the night and escaped. It could be anywhere now, in the backyard, inside the house, or maybe it had already gone far away. "My parents will kill me if they find out," said Jake, his voice trembling. "Calm down," Pete said, trying to seem braver than he really was. "It probably went away. Snakes don't like to stay near houses with people." "Are you sure?" asked Mark. "Of course," Pete replied, though he wasn't sure of anything. They looked for the snake for almost an hour, searching every corner of the backyard, looking under every stone, every flower pot, every possible hiding place. They found no sign of it. Finally, they decided that the snake had really gone away. It was the only explanation that made sense and didn't leave them completely terrified. Jake put the empty bottle back in the storage room, in the same place where he had put it the night before, and the three went to school, promising never to talk about the subject again. But life has a peculiar way of following its course, and sometimes what we think has been forgotten remains only dormant, waiting for the right moment to return to the surface. The months passed. Summer gave way to a brief winter, which in turn gave way to another scorching summer. Jake, Pete, and Mark continued being friends, continued having their adventures, but never again tried to capture snakes. Occasionally, one of them would mention the bottle incident, always with a nervous smile, always changing the subject right after. Jake grew a few inches, his voice began to deepen, and he developed a growing interest in the girls at school. Pete discovered a passion for football and spent most of his free time kicking an old ball on the field near his house. Mark, the youngest, continued being the most adventurous of the group, always proposing new expeditions and discoveries. The life in Little Millerville followed its slow and predictable rhythm. The same families, the same streets, the same problems and joys as always. The drought continued to be a constant problem. Politicians continued making the same empty promises, and young people continued dreaming of a future in the big cities. It was on an afternoon in March 1988, almost a year after the snake incident, that fate decided it was time to collect the price for the forgotten mischief. Jake had arrived from school earlier than normal. The math teacher had been absent, and the principal decided to dismiss the younger classes. He came home to find the house empty, as always happened at that time. His parents were still working, and he would have a few hours alone before they returned. It was hot, very hot. The kind of heat that stuck to your skin and made any activity a superhuman effort. Jake decided it was a good time to organize the storage room in the backyard. His mother had asked him several times to do this, complaining about the mess and the amount of useless junk he accumulated there. He opened the storage room door and was hit with the hot, stuffy air that had accumulated there during the day. The smell was a mixture of old wood, damp cardboard, and something else he couldn't identify. Something slightly sweet, but not unpleasant. Jake began working methodically, separating what was useful from what could be thrown away. There were old magazines he had kept since he was 8, some broken tools that might be fixable, toys he hadn't used in years but still awakened some nostalgia. It was when he moved the second cardboard box that he saw it. The plastic bottle was there, in the same place where he had put it almost a year before. Only now, it wasn't empty. There was something inside. Jake picked up the bottle and held it up against the light coming through the small storage room window. There inside, coiled at the bottom, was the snake. The same snake that they had captured on that hot summer afternoon. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. How was it possible? How had the snake returned inside the bottle? And more importantly, how had it survived all these months? Looking more carefully, Jake noticed that the snake seemed different. It was thinner, almost skeletal, and its colors had faded. Its scales, which once gleamed in the sun, now seemed opaque and lifeless. But it was alive. Jake could see the subtle movements of its breathing, the occasional tremor of its tail. The bottle cap was tightly screwed on, so tight that Jake had to use force to turn it. How had the snake gotten in there? And how had it survived so long without food or water? Jake knew he should be afraid. He knew he should put the bottle down and run away, but curiosity was stronger. Like a scientist faced with an impossible discovery, he couldn't stop observing that creature that defied all the laws of nature he knew. He turned the cap a little more, just enough to release the internal pressure. Immediately, he felt a strange odor escape from the bottle. It wasn't a bad smell, but it was different, sweet and heavy, like very ripe fruit. The snake moved, a sudden and unexpected movement that made Jake take a step back. But he didn't drop the bottle. Something kept him hypnotized, as if it were important that he finish what he had started almost a year before. Jake continued turning the cap, slowly, watching through the transparent plastic how the snake reacted to each movement. It seemed to be waking up from a very long sleep. Its movements became more coordinated, more intentional. When the cap finally came off completely, Jake felt a gust of hot air escape from the bottle, air that smelled of wet earth and something he couldn't identify. The snake raised its head, its small black eyes focusing on the boy's face. For an instant that seemed like an eternity, boy and snake looked at each other. Jake could swear there was something almost human in those eyes, something that spoke of months of imprisonment, of hunger, of supernatural patience, something that spoke of revenge. The snake attacked with a speed Jake never imagined possible, a fluid and precise movement that covered the distance between the bottle and his neck in less than 1 second. He felt the fangs pierce his skin just below his left ear, and immediately a burning sensation spread through the area. He dropped the bottle, which shattered on the packed dirt floor of the storage room. The snake fell along with the plastic pieces, but immediately recovered and slithered quickly under one of the cardboard boxes. For a few seconds, Jake stood still, touching the bite site, 2 small perforations from which blood was flowing. He looked toward where the snake had disappeared and felt a mixture of anger and fear. How had that animal managed to survive all these months? And why had it returned exactly to the same place where they had imprisoned it? These questions echoed in his mind while a strange sensation began to take over his body. Initially, he thought it was just the shock, his heart beating fast, his hands trembling slightly. But there was something more, something that was changing inside him, in a way he couldn't identify.
Jake tried to leave the storage room, but his legs seemed heavier than normal. Each step required conscious effort, as if he needed to remind his muscles how to work. He leaned against the door frame and breathed deeply, trying to calm himself. That's when he realized his breathing was different, more labored, more difficult, as if his lungs were working against some invisible resistance. He brought his hand to his neck again and felt that the area around the bite was beginning to swell. Panic began to set in when Jake realized he couldn't completely feel the fingers of his left hand. It was as if they were numb, but in a different way from normal numbness, a sensation that slowly moved up his arm, like cold water rising through a pipe. He managed to reach the backyard area, but the sunlight seemed to intensify all the symptoms. His vision became temporarily blurred, and he had to blink several times to focus. The world around him seemed to be moving in slow motion, and at the same time too fast for him to follow. Jake knew he needed help. He needed to get to the house and call someone, anyone. But when he tried to shout, he discovered that his voice had become a hoarse whisper. His tongue seemed to have grown, filling his entire mouth, and he began salivating excessively. The path to the house had never seemed so long. Each step was a battle against a body that was rebelling against his will. Jake managed to reach the kitchen door, but when he tried to turn the handle, he discovered that his motor coordination was seriously compromised. It took 3 attempts to open the door. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his fingers wouldn't obey the commands his brain sent. When he finally managed to get in, he leaned against the wall and tried to assess his situation. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 3:40 in the afternoon. His parents wouldn't be back from work until 7. 4 hours. He would have to endure 4 hours in that condition or find a way to ask for help before it was too late. Jake tried to head to the phone in the living room, but his legs gave out when he was halfway there. The fall was heavy and uncontrolled. He hit his shoulder on the corner of the kitchen table and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against the cabinet. The pain from the impact was sharp, but lasted only a few seconds before being absorbed by the numbness that now took over almost the entire left side of his body. His left arm was completely useless, and he began losing sensation in his leg on the same side. Lying on the cold kitchen floor, Jake tried to drag himself toward the phone. The phone was only a few meters away, but it seemed to be miles away. Each movement was a superhuman effort, and he progressed only a few inches at a time. It was during this desperate attempt to reach the phone that Jake began having the first serious breathing difficulties. His breathing became shorter, more labored, as if his lungs were being compressed by an invisible force. Saliva was accumulating in his mouth faster than he could swallow, and he began making strange sounds when breathing. Sounds he'd never made before,
sounds that were frighteningly non-human. Jake stopped trying to drag himself and lay still on the floor, trying to concentrate only on breathing. Each inhalation was a small victory, each exhalation a fight against the panic that threatened to consume him completely. It was in this moment of despair that Jake began having strange visions. Not hallucinations exactly, but memories that seemed more vivid than the reality around him. He remembered perfectly that afternoon almost a year ago when they captured the snake. He could feel again the scorching heat of the sun, the smell of dust on the road, the excitement of an adventure shared with friends. But now these memories had a different quality. It was as if he were seeing everything from the snake's point of view. He could feel the animal's terror when it was pushed into the bottle, the claustrophobia of the cramped space, the long months of darkness and loneliness. These visions were so real that for several moments Jake completely forgot where he was. He was simultaneously the boy on the kitchen floor, slowly dying, and the imprisoned animal, surviving against all odds, driven by a single purpose: revenge. The word echoed in his mind with crystal clarity: revenge. The snake hadn't simply survived by chance. It had kept itself alive through pure willpower, feeding on a cold and calculating rage that grew during all those months of captivity. Jake understood, with a clarity that transcended his deteriorating physical condition, that it hadn't been an accident that he found the bottle on that specific day. The snake had waited. It had somehow known he would return and had prepared for this moment with the patience of a born predator. This understanding should have terrified him even more, but strangely it had the opposite effect. A deep calm settled over Jake, an almost zen acceptance of the situation. He had participated in something that had changed the natural course of things, and now he was paying the price for that interference. His breathing was getting more difficult, but he no longer fought against it. He closed his eyes and surrendered to the sensations taking over his body. He could feel his heart beating slower, could feel blood circulating with less force, could feel life gradually draining from his limbs. And he could feel something more, a presence, as if the snake were still there, watching, making sure justice would be served to the end. Jake's last minutes of life were a unique and terrible experience. Lying on the cold kitchen floor, he floated between consciousness and something that wasn't exactly unconsciousness, but rather an altered state where time and space seemed to function differently. He could hear sounds with supernatural clarity. The tick-tock of the clock on the wall echoed like drum beats. The distant hum of the refrigerator sounded like an airplane engine. Even his own labored breathing created echoes that reverberated throughout the entire house. But at the same time, his vision was fragmenting. The kitchen ceiling seemed to be dividing into small squares, like a puzzle someone was slowly taking apart. Colors were becoming more intense and at the same time paler, creating an impossible visual effect. Jake tried once more to move toward the phone, but discovered he had completely lost control of his limbs. His arms and legs simply no longer responded to his brain's commands. It was as if the connection between his mind and body had been cut by an external force. Strangely, this didn't frighten him as much as it should have. There was an almost hypnotic quality to the entire experience, as if he were watching it all happen to someone else from a safe and comfortable distance. His thoughts began drifting into philosophical territory. He wondered about the nature of revenge, about whether animals were really capable of feelings as complex as resentment and thirst for justice. Had the snake really planned all of this, or was he attributing human characteristics to an event that had simply been the result of biological coincidences? These questions seemed tremendously important at that moment, more important even than his own survival. He felt as if he were on the edge of a great revelation about the nature of existence, about the invisible connections that linked all living creatures. He thought of Pete and Mark and wondered if they would ever know the truth about what had happened, if they would carry the guilt for the rest of their lives, or if they would manage to convince themselves it had been just a terrible and unpredictable accident. Jake's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow.
Each inspiration required tremendous conscious effort, and he began to realize that soon he wouldn't have the energy to sustain even this basic function. That's when he heard something impossible, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, the distinctive sound of something crawling across the kitchen floor. Jake forced his blurred eyes to focus, and there it was. The snake had left its hiding place in the storage room and had dragged itself to the house. It was now only a few meters from him, watching him with those small black eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom and all the malice in the world. For a moment that seemed to last in eternity, boy and snake looked into each other's eyes. Jake could swear he saw something almost human in that gaze, an intelligence that transcended that of a simple animal, a consciousness that had been forged through months of suffering and isolation. The snake made no aggressive movement. It simply remained there, watching, as if it wanted to make sure its work was being completed adequately, as if it wanted to witness the exact moment when the scales of justice would finally balance. Jake tried to speak, tried to ask for forgiveness or explain that it had been just a child's prank, but couldn't produce any sound. His lips moved, but no words came out. The snake seemed to understand anyway. Its head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that could have been interpreted as acceptance, or perhaps as farewell. Then, as silently as it had arrived, it turned and slithered back toward the backyard, disappearing through the door Jake had left open. Jake's last thoughts were surprisingly peaceful. He remembered the feeling of playing in the creek with Pete and Mark during summer, the texture of hot sand between his toes, the taste of ripe fruit that fell from the trees in his grandmother's backyard. He remembered his mother singing while preparing dinner, his father teaching him to ride a bike, the nights when the whole family gathered around the television to watch shows. These happy memories mixed with the physical reality of his death, creating an experience that was simultaneously terrible and beautiful, as if his entire life were being distilled into a few precious moments of pure emotional essence.